history lovers, and welcome back to Vibing History. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the echoes of the past wash over you. Today, we journey through a truly transformative era, a 3-century span that reshaped the very soul of Europe, the High Middle Ages. From booming populations to soaring cathedrals, from holy wars to the birth of new ideas, this was a time of breathtaking change, both glorious and brutal. Before we dive into the depths of this fascinating period, please take a moment to hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this narrative with fellow history enthusiasts. Your support fuels these journeys into the past. Now let the story unfold. All right, everyone, settle in. Grab that blanket. Get comfortable, because we're about to delve into a period of history that, while often overshadowed by its dramatic predecessors and successors, was absolutely foundational. We're talking about the High Middle Ages. Forget the Dark Ages, forget the grim survival stories. This, my friends, is where Europe started to breathe again. It's where the embers of progress, once thought extinguished, began to glow, then flicker, then truly ignite into a societal furnace that would reshape the continent. We're charting the course from roughly the year 1000 to the year 1300. 300 years. Think of it. 3 centuries of profound, almost dizzying change. What came before the early Middle Ages was a time of consolidation, of recovery from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, of fending off persistent barbarian incursions. But by the turn of the millennium, something shifted. The invasions, those relentless waves of outsiders, had largely subsided. Europe, for the first time in a very long time, found a semblance of peace, a stability that allowed it to look inward, to build, to grow. And grow it did. Perhaps the most significant, the most utterly transformative trend of the High Middle Ages was the explosion of population. Imagine a continent, vast and green, still largely wild, but now, finally ready to be settled. From around the year 780, Europe had started to become more organized, more cohesive. The Carolingian Renaissance, a beacon of learning and culture in the preceding centuries, had already laid some intellectual groundwork. But now, with a burgeoning population, that intellectual curiosity began to blossom. The very first universities, those hallowed halls of learning that still define our pursuit of knowledge today, began to spring up. Bologna, Oxford, Paris, Salamanca, Cambridge, Medina. These weren't just names on a map. They were centers of intellectual gravity, attracting scholars and students, churning out new ideas, challenging old ones. This wasn't just about more people. It was about more hands. More hands to clear land, more hands to farm, more hands to build, more hands to think. What historian Charles Agounet famously called the Great Clearances began in earnest. Vast, ancient forests, marshes stretching for miles. These wild spaces that had dominated the European landscape for millennia started to recede. Peasants, driven by the need for land and the promise of a better life, pushed outward, axe and plow in hand. They weren't just reclaiming land within traditional borders, they were expanding them. Beyond the Elbe River, for instance, settlers pushed east, tripling the size of what we now know as Germany. Think about that for a moment. Tripling the size of a major European power, not through conquest alone, but through sheer industrious settlement. This demographic boom wasn't some abstract concept. It had tangible, immediate impacts. The European economy, once stagnant, began to hum with activity. By 1350, this robust population increase had propelled the economy to levels that, in some areas, wouldn't be seen again until the 19th century. Imagine that kind of prosperity, a flourishing that truly stood the test of centuries. Of course, this golden age wasn't to last indefinitely. The early 14th century would bring its own set of calamities, regional wars, economic stagnation, and of course, the terrifying specter of the Black Death, which would reshape Europe once more. But for now, for these 3 centuries, Europe was experiencing a renaissance of its own making. This era also saw the final echoes of the great migrations that had defined the early Middle Ages. The Vikings, once the scourge of coastal Europe, were settling down. They established themselves in the British Isles, in France, even developing Christian kingdoms in their Scandinavian homelands. The Magyars, another formidable nomadic force, ceased their expansion by the 10th century, and by the year 1000, a Christian kingdom of Hungary emerged, forming alliances, integrating itself into the European tapestry. With the brief, terrifying exception of the Mongol invasions in the 13th century, the era of major nomadic incursions was, for all intents and purposes, over. Europe could finally focus on itself. But focusing on itself didn't mean it wasn't looking outward. Far from it. This was the period when the Catholic Church reached the absolute zenith of its political power. It wasn't just a spiritual guide. It was a temporal force, a political entity that could summon armies from across the continent. And it did. The Crusades, those epic, often brutal, expeditions to the Holy Land, began in this period. Europe, in a unified, albeit religiously fervent, push, sought to reclaim territories from Muslim control. These crusades, while driven by faith, also opened up new trade routes, exposed Europeans to new cultures, and had profound, complex consequences that would echo for centuries. And it wasn't just the Holy Land. The Christian kingdoms of Iberia were engaged in the long, arduous process of the Reconquista, gradually pushing back Muslim rule across the peninsula. The Normans, those incredibly adaptable and ambitious warriors, conquered southern Italy, establishing new kingdoms, further integrating diverse populations under Christian rule. These weren't isolated events. They were all part of this grand narrative of population growth, resettlement, and expansion that defined the High Middle Ages. Beyond the political and demographic shifts, the High Middle Ages was a period of incredible intellectual, spiritual, and artistic ferment. We see the rise of ethnocentrism, the seeds of what would later become modern national identities, beginning to sprout across Europe. The great Italian city-states, Pisa, Amalfi, Genoa, Venice, began their ascendancy, becoming formidable thalassocracies, masters of the seas, their coffers overflowing with the riches of Eastern Mediterranean trade. These weren't just cities. They were independent republics, centers of wealth and innovation, laying the groundwork for the later Renaissance. And speaking of Renaissance, this period saw a magnificent rediscovery. The works of Aristotle, long lost to Western Europe, began to filter back, first indirectly, through the brilliant minds of medieval Jewish and Islamic philosophers like Maimonides, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd. Then, directly, as crusades and increased contact with the Byzantine and Muslim worlds opened up ancient libraries. These texts, combined with the burgeoning intellectual environment of the new universities, sparked a philosophical revolution. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas synthesized these rediscovered ancient philosophies with Judeo-Islamic and Catholic ideologies, giving birth to scholasticism, a rigorous, logical approach to understanding faith and reason. While Western Europe was experiencing this dynamic rebirth, Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Byzantine Empire, largely remained Europe's most populous city. Byzantine art, a continuation of classical traditions with a uniquely spiritual overlay, reached its peak in the 12th century, its mosaics and icons shimmering with divine light. And in architecture, perhaps the most visible legacy of this era, we see the first great Gothic cathedrals rising towards the heavens. These weren't just buildings. They were sermons in stone, testaments to faith and human ingenuity, their soaring arches and stained glass windows a dramatic departure from the heavier Romanesque styles that preceded them. Let's turn our gaze now to the specific kingdoms and regions that were shaped by these forces. In England, the Norman conquest of 1066 had already fundamentally altered the course of history. A Francophone nobility now ruled, bringing with them new customs, new language, and a new administrative efficiency. The Normans, never ones to stay put, also invaded Ireland in 1169, establishing strongholds and gradually extending their influence. Scotland and Wales, too, felt the pressures, becoming vassal states, though Scotland would later fiercely reassert its independence. King Henry I, in the 12th century, established the Exchequer, a sophisticated system for managing royal finances. And in 1215, a pivotal moment, King John, facing rebellion and the loss of Normandy, was forced to sign the Magna Carta, a document that, for the first time, significantly limited the power of English monarchs, laying crucial groundwork for future constitutional governance. Across the Iberian Peninsula, the story was dominated by the Christian Reconquista. The conquest of Toledo in 1085 was a watershed moment, pushing the Christian frontier further south. This wasn't just a territorial shift, it was a societal transformation. The northern Christian kingdoms became war-torn societies, their structures and relations utterly subordinated to the demands of omnipresent military conflict. Border societies emerged, where military prowess and settlement were prioritized, where knights and foot soldiers were granted privileges for pushing the frontier. Military orders, those unique blends of monasticism and soldiery, played a crucial role in these borderlands. While Muslim-ruled Al-Andalus, with its intensive agriculture and demographic edge, enjoyed a period of significant cultural and scientific achievement. The arrival of the Almoravids and Almohads from northern Africa brought with it more volatile state structures and a shift in focus. The constant back and forth, the clash of cultures and faiths, created a uniquely vibrant and often brutal crucible in Iberia. In Italy, the Norman conquests of the south led to the formation of the powerful Kingdom of Sicily, a hereditary monarchy that would later be joined to the Holy Roman Empire, reaching its zenith under the enigmatic Emperor Frederick II. But it was in the north that another kind of power was blossoming, the independent city-states. Pisa, Amalfi, Genoa, and Venice. These thalassocracies, masters of the seas, became major financial centers, their trade networks stretching across the Mediterranean, bringing immense wealth and cultural exchange to Europe. Their maritime prowess was not just economic, it was military, their fleets protecting their commercial interests and projecting their power. Up in Scandinavia, the period from the mid-10th to mid-11th centuries saw the unification and Christianization of the various kingdoms. This brought an end to the Viking raids, those fearsome expeditions that had once terrorized Europe and drew these northern realms more deeply into the broader European political landscape. King Knut of Denmark, for a time, even ruled over England and Norway, a vast North Sea empire. While Danish predominance eventually waned, Norway expanded its Atlantic possessions, stretching from Greenland to the Isle of Man, and Sweden, under figures like Birger Jarl, began to build its power base in the Baltic Sea. Even with civil wars raging in Norway and shifts in power, the Scandinavian nations were now firmly part of the European family, no longer just on its wild fringes. France and Germany, successors to the sprawling Carolingian Empire, were also carving out their distinct identities. France, moving westward, saw the rise and fall of formidable powers like the Angevin Empire, which controlled much of its territory in the 12th and early 13th centuries, before the French kings gradually reclaimed their lands, forging a more unified French kingdom. Germany, meanwhile, lay under the banner of the Holy Roman Empire, a complex and often sprawling entity that reached its peak of unity and political power under the legendary Kaiser Frederick Barbarossa. His attempts to assert imperial authority over the powerful German princes and the wealthy Italian city-states would be a defining struggle of the era. But the story of the High Middle Ages isn't just about Western Europe. Far to the east, the Kingdom of Georgia experienced a magnificent golden age under King David IV, who successfully expelled the Seljuk Empire from its lands, culminating in the decisive victory at the Battle of Didgori in 1121. His granddaughter, Queen Tamar, continued this ascent, consolidating an empire that stretched from the Black Sea to the Caspian. Georgia, for a time, became a leading regional power, a testament to the resilience and ambition of its rulers, before eventually succumbing to the relentless Mongol invasions. Hungary, too, rose to prominence, becoming one of the most powerful medieval states in Europe under the Arpad dynasty. King Saint Stephen I established the Christian Kingdom of Hungary in 1000, and subsequent rulers like Saint Ladislaus consolidated its power, extending Hungarian influence over southeast Europe and the Carpathian region, even entering a personal union with Croatia. The Arpad dynasty, remarkably, produced numerous saints and blessed figures from a single family, a reflection of the deep Christian faith that permeated this era. Further north, Lithuania emerged as a duchy, briefly becoming a kingdom, and, remarkably, remaining unconquered during the Lithuanian Crusade. It rapidly expanded eastward through conquest, growing into one of the largest states in Europe, a formidable power in its own right. Poland, likewise, emerged as a duchy in the mid-10th century under Mieszko I, and by 1025, under Boleslaw the Brave, was crowned a kingdom, solidifying its place on the European stage. Southeast Europe saw the height and then the decline of Kievan Rus, a powerful Slavic state, and the emergence of Cumania. The Byzantine Empire, though still dominant in the early part of this period, experienced a revival of prosperity under the Komnenian emperors. However, its grip on southeast Europe began to loosen, marked by the successful Vlach-Bulgarian rebellion in 1185. The region became a patchwork of Byzantine, Bulgarian, and Serbian territories, all vying for power. And then, the ultimate blow, the treacherous Fourth Crusade in 1204, which captured and sacked Constantinople itself. This act, perpetrated by fellow Christians, severely damaged the Byzantine Empire, weakening it against the rising threats of the Seljuks and ultimately the Ottoman Empire. The Latin Empire, established by the Crusaders, was short-lived, routed by the Bulgarian Emperor Kaloyan in the Battle of Adrianople in 1205. The political landscape of Eastern Europe was a swirling vortex of shifting alliances and brutal conflicts, paving the way for new powers to rise and old ones to fade. Now, let's consider the environmental backdrop against which all this drama unfolded. The High Middle Ages coincided with what historians call the medieval warm period, a stretch from the 10th to the 14th century that was, for Europe, a relatively warm and gentle interval. Imagine it. A climate more conducive to agriculture, fewer brutal winters. Farmers were able to grow wheat further north into Scandinavia and even cultivate wine grapes in northern England. A surprising thought today. This relative protection from famine, though not absolute, allowed Europe's population to swell, even accounting for devastating events like the famine of 1315. This increased population wasn't just a number. It was the engine that drove the founding of new towns, a surge in industrial and economic activity, and the expansion of trade networks. New ways of farming emerged, the heavy plow, allowing for deeper cultivation of stubborn European soils, the use of horses instead of slower oxen, and the crucial three-field system, which allowed for a greater variety of crops, including nitrogen-fixing legumes, preventing soil depletion. These seemingly small agricultural innovations had enormous, cascading effects, supporting the growing population and fueling economic growth. Amidst all this change, a profound cultural shift was also underway: the rise of chivalry. The idea of the Christian warrior began to evolve. No longer just a brute with a sword, the ideal knight was now envisioned as selfless, faithful, and fiercely protective of the weak. Household heavy cavalry, the knights we often imagine in shining armor, became common across Europe by the 11th century. Tournaments, those spectacular displays of martial prowess, were invented, allowing knights to establish their family names, gather wealth, and earn renown. In the 12th century, the reforming Cluny monks promoted ethical warfare, even inspiring the formation of military orders like the Knights Templar, who blurred the lines between monk and warrior. Inherited titles of nobility became firmly established, cementing social hierarchies that would endure for centuries. By the 13th century in Germany, knighthood itself could be an inherited title, a fascinating blend of martial skill and aristocratic lineage. Religious life, as you might expect, was absolutely central to the High Middle Ages, but even here, dramatic changes were afoot. The year 1054 saw the formal East-West Schism, a profound theological and political break that permanently divided the Christian Church into Roman Catholicism in Western Europe and Eastern Orthodoxy in the East. This wasn't just a theological quibble. It was a schism that would shape the geopolitical landscape of Europe for the next 1,000 years, driven by disagreements over papal authority, the wording of the creed, and liturgical practices. And then, of course, there were the Crusades. Conducted under papal authority, these were initially aimed at re-establishing Christian rule in the Holy Land. From the First Crusade, which saw the capture of Jerusalem, to the subsequent 8 or 9 attempts, these are not just military campaigns. They were mass movements of people driven by faith, greed, and the promise of salvation. In their wake, new entities emerged: the monastic military orders. The Knights Templar, initially founded to protect pilgrims, became deeply involved in banking, ultimately acquiring immense wealth and power, only to be brutally suppressed by Philip the Fair in the early 14th century on charges of heresy. The Knights Hospitaller, originally a hospital order, also became a formidable military force, defending the Crusader states before eventually relocating to Rhodes and then Malta. And the Teutonic Knights, a German order, after their efforts in the Holy Land proved futile, turned their attention to the Baltic region, invading pagan Prussia with the aim of Christianizing it, often through ruthless military conquest. These orders, with their unique blend of religious fervor and martial discipline, left an indelible mark on the history of warfare and faith. Within the Church itself, the intellectual landscape was being reshaped by scholasticism, influenced by Anselm of Canterbury and, crucially, by the rediscovery of Aristotle's works, first through Jewish and Muslim thinkers, and then directly from Byzantine libraries. Scholasticism sought to reconcile faith and reason. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the most famous of them all, argued for empiricism and used logic to support Roman Catholic doctrines, moving away from the more mystical Platonist Augustinian traditions. They believed the mind at birth was a tabula rasa, a blank slate, capable of thought and understanding through a divine spark. This was a profound shift, laying the intellectual foundations for later scientific inquiry. This period was also a golden age for monasticism, particularly in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. The black-robed Benedictines and the white-robed Cistercians, founded by figures like Bernard of Clairvaux, spread across Europe, their monasteries becoming centers of learning, prayer, and agricultural innovation. But the 13th century saw the rise of a new phenomenon: the mendicant orders. The Franciscans, founded by the beloved Saint Francis of Assisi, the Carmelites, the Dominicans, and the Augustinians, these friars, unlike the enclosed monks, took vows of poverty and actively preached in the growing urban centers, bringing the church directly to the people. They offered a new, more immediate spiritual experience, often living among the poor and dispossessed. However, not all religious movements were welcomed by the church. The High Middle Ages also saw the rise of widespread heretical movements. Before this period, heresies were usually isolated, local affairs. But with the growth of urban centers, the rise of free merchants, and a new money-based economy, rural monastic values held less appeal for many city dwellers. Large-scale movements like Catholicism, with its Gnostic, dualistic beliefs about a struggle between good and evil forces, took hold in southern France and northern Italy. The Church, seeing this as an existential threat, responded with brutal force, launching the Albigensian Crusade to eradicate the Cathars. Then there were the Waldensians, founded by Peter Waldo of Lyon, a wealthy merchant who gave up his riches to preach a gospel of strict scriptural adherence and poverty, criticizing the excesses of the clergy. Excommunicated by the Church, the Waldensians persisted, becoming a forerunner to the later Protestant Reformation, their churches still existing today. These movements, both orthodox and heterodox, speak to the intense spiritual ferment of the age, a search for meaning and a struggle for religious authority that often played out with dramatic and tragic consequences. Economically, the High Middle Ages was a powerhouse. In Northern Europe, the Hanseatic League emerged, a powerful federation of free cities like Lübeck, Amsterdam, Cologne, and Gdansk, which dominated sea trade, establishing a vast commercial network that stretched from England to Russia. These Hanseatic cities were economic juggernauts, and through their trade, Germans began to colonize lands beyond the Holy Roman Empire, expanding into Prussia and Silesia. And then, of course, there were the great explorers and travelers. In the late 13th century, a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo embarked on his legendary journey along the Silk Road to China, becoming one of the first Europeans to document his travels in detail in Il Million. His accounts, fantastical as they might have seemed, opened Western eyes to the wonders and riches of the Far East, inspiring a wave of Christian missionaries and other travelers to follow in his footsteps. This was the nascent stirring of a global consciousness, a broadening of horizons that would eventually lead to the Age of Discovery. The scientific and technological progress of the High Middle Ages is often underestimated. For centuries after the fall of Rome, Western Europe relied on fragmented copies of ancient Greek texts, mostly in Latin. But the 12th century Renaissance changed everything. Increased contact with the Islamic world in Spain and Sicily, and with the Byzantine world and the Levant during the Crusades, gave Europeans access to a treasure trove of scientific Arabic and Greek texts, including the complete works of Aristotle, Alhazen, and Averroes. The newly established universities played a critical role in translating and propagating these texts, creating an entirely new infrastructure for scientific communities. By the early 13th century, reasonably accurate Latin translations of almost all the crucial ancient authors were available, allowing for a robust transfer of scientific ideas. Scholars like Robert Grosseteste, Roger Bacon, Albertus Magnus, and Duns Scotus began to extend these natural sciences, with Grosseteste emphasizing mathematics as a way to understand nature, and Bacon championing an empirical approach, clear precursors to the modern scientific method. Indeed, the 12th and 13th centuries saw an astonishing acceleration in new inventions and innovations. Alfred W. Crosby famously described this as a technological revolution. In less than a century, more inventions were developed and applied than in the previous 1,000 years of human history globally. Windmills and watermills, harnessed for power, the nascent forms of printing before movable type, gunpowder arriving from the east, the astrolabe, a navigational marvel, spectacles enhancing vision, improved clocks, better ships. These were not minor improvements. The improved ships and navigation tools, in particular, would lay the groundwork for the Age of Discovery itself. We see the earliest written record of a windmill in Yorkshire in 1185, paper manufacturing beginning in Italy around 1270, the spinning wheel arriving from India, the magnetic compass appearing in Europe in the late 12th century, and eyeglasses invented in Italy in the 1280s. Fibonacci, through his Liber Abyssai in 1202, introduced Hindu-Arabic numerals to Europe, revolutionizing mathematics and accounting. And a stern-mounted rudder, a crucial innovation for ship steering, is depicted in church carvings from around 1180. These were truly transformative inventions, reshaping daily life and setting the stage for future advancements. The visual arts of the High Middle Ages were rich and diverse. Anglo-Saxon art, with its intricate metalwork and illuminated manuscripts, influenced the British Isles until the Norman invasion. Romanesque art, with its roots in classical traditions, was prevalent, but then the revolutionary Gothic art began to develop, especially in architecture, taking on a distinct Germanic flavor. In the East, Byzantine art continued its own magnificent traditions, influencing much of Eastern Europe with its shimmering mosaics and icons. And of course, illuminated manuscripts, painstakingly crafted by monastic scribes, reached new heights of artistic expression in both Catholic and Orthodox churches, bringing sacred texts to life with vibrant colors and intricate designs. Architecturally, the Gothic style was the undisputed marvel of the High Middle Ages, decisively superseding the Romanesque. Imagine those dark, bulky Romanesque forms. now giving way to structures that seem to defy gravity. The combination of flying buttresses, pointed arches, and ribbed vaults allowed for unprecedented height and lightness. It was a spiritual architecture, religious in its very essence. Thin horizontal lines, delicate grates. Everything strove towards the sky. Light, seen as an expression of God himself, flooded through vast, colorful stained glass windows, creating an awe-inspiring impact on the common person. The intricate ribbed and fan vaultings drew the eye heavenward, a constant reminder of the divine. The sheer size of these cathedrals, like the magnificent Notre Dame de Paris, was a testament to God's greatness and an invitation to spiritual elevation. The very floor plan of a Gothic cathedral, as Erwin Panofsky argued, mirrored the systematic divisions of scholastic thought, an architectural expression of the intellectual rigor of the age. Literature, too, flourished, drawing from a variety of cultures, with Christianity as a dominant influence. Latin literature, still the language of the church and scholarship, informed vernacular languages, leading to literary cycles like the Matter of Rome, based on classical antiquity. Then there was the Matter of France, epic tales of Charlemagne and his court, and the acritic songs of Byzantium's frontiersmen. But perhaps the most enduring and beloved was the Matter of Britain, tales of King Arthur, his knights, and the legends of Brittany, Cornwall, Wales, and Ireland, stories that continue to captivate us today. An anonymous German poet gave us the Nibelungenlied, attempting to elevate Germanic myths to the epic status of French and British tales. Historical writings and poetry also abounded, such as Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae. The Byzantine scholarly tradition, even with political decline, remained incredibly fruitful. Philosophers like Michael Sellos reinvigorated Neoplatonism, while his successor, Ioannes Attalos, continued a Platonic line of thought, though not without controversy. Orthodox theologians like Nikephoros Blemmedides and Maximus Planudes engaged in dialogue between Eastern and Western churches. Byzantine historical tradition flourished with works by Nicetas and Michael Coniates. The 12th century also saw the rise of the Byzantine novel, a synthesis of ancient pagan and Christian themes, and the Temerian, an Orthodox Christian anticipation of Dante's Divine Comedy. In southern France, Occitan literature emerged, famous for its troubadours who sang of courtly love, blending Latin, Arab-influenced Spanish, and North African elements. This influence spread, inspiring the trouvères in northern France, the Minnesänger in Germany, and laying the foundation for the sweet new style of Dante and Petrarch in Italy. Indeed, Dante's Divine Comedy, that epic allegorical poem, is in many ways a product of both Aquinas' theology and the secular Occitan literary tradition. Music in the High Middle Ages, as much of it was preserved in religious institutions, is primarily religious in nature. Gregorian chant, that serene, monophonic form of church music, was dominant. But from it, new forms began to emerge. Organum, clausulae, conductus, and eventually the motet, all building upon the chant as source material. Guido of Arezzo, in the 11th century, developed musical notation, making it easier for singers to learn and remember these chants. The 12th and 13th centuries were a crucial period as plain chant gave birth to polyphony, multiple independent melodic lines sung simultaneously, in the works of the French Notre Dame school, with figures like Léonin and Periton. This evolved into the Ars Nova of the late Middle Ages. The nun Hildegard of Bingen, a visionary composer and mystic, was another important musical figure. Secular music also thrived, most notably with the troubadours of Occitania. These itinerant poets and musicians from all social classes sang of courtly love, heroism, and satire. Their style influenced the trouvères of northern France, the Minzingers of Germany, and composers of secular music in Italy. Finally, let's talk about theater. Economic and political changes led to the growth of guilds and towns, and this, in turn, transformed theater. Trade guilds began to perform plays, often religiously based, reenacting biblical stories that referenced their own professions. a baker's guild performing the Last Supper, for instance. These vernacular mystery plays, performed in cycles with dozens of individual plays, were incredibly popular across the British Isles, France, and Germany. They weren't just solemn affairs. They often included elements of comedy, devils, villains, and clowns, entertaining as well as instructing. And secular performances, too, began to emerge, with works like the play of the Greenwood by Adam de la Halle in 1276, incorporating satire, fairies, and supernatural elements. Farces, emphasizing sex and bodily excretions, also surged in popularity after the 13th century, showing a robust and often bawdy theatrical tradition. So, as you can hear, the High Middle Ages was anything but boring. It was a time of immense growth, innovation, spiritual ferment, and dramatic shifts in power and culture. From the roar of clearing forests to the quiet contemplation of new philosophies, from the clash of crusader armies to the soaring beauty of Gothic cathedrals, this was an era that laid the very foundations of modern Europe. It was a period of awakening, a time when humanity, after centuries of struggle, truly began to find its stride again. Now, let's rest here for a moment. Let these images and ideas sink in before we continue our journey into the next segment, where we will explore the Holy War and Heresy. As the 11th century dawned, a profound shift began to ripple across Europe, a transformation not merely of demographics, but of the very spirit of the age. We've explored the burgeoning populations, the clearances of forests, the new towns, and the faint murmur of progress that began to echo across the continent. But even as the fields were tilled and cities grew, another power, perhaps the most pervasive and influential of all, was reaching its zenith: the Christian Church. Imagine, if you will, a world where the spiritual and the temporal were not merely intertwined, but almost indistinguishable. The Church wasn't just a dispenser of sacraments. It was the ultimate authority, the moral compass, the legal arbiter, and often the largest landowner. From the humblest peasant's hut to the grandest royal court, the shadow and light of the Church touched every aspect of life. It shaped laws, legitimized rulers, and offered the promise of salvation, or the terrifying threat of eternal damnation. This was a time when faith was not a private matter, but a communal, all-encompassing force. And within this landscape of fervent belief, two monumental events would shake the foundations of Christendom and forever alter the course of history: the formal sundering of East and West, and the rallying cry for holy war. The year 1054 marks a seismic rift, a schism that would divide the Christian world into two distinct halves: Roman Catholicism in the West and Eastern Orthodoxy in the East. It was a culmination of centuries of growing theological, liturgical, and political disagreements. Picture two towering figures, Pope Leo IX in Rome and Patriarch Michael I in Constantinople, each convinced of the righteousness of his own authority, each firm in his interpretation of divine truth. They excommunicated each other, a spiritual anathema flung across a continent, ostensibly over a single phrase added to the Nicene Creed, the Filioque, which concerned the procession of the Holy Spirit. But it was more than just a theological squabble. It was a clash of cultures, of power dynamics, and of differing views on the very nature of papal supremacy. This wasn't merely a debate among learned men. It was a fracture that ran through the heart of Europe, leaving scars that endure to this day. And then, just a few decades later, came the call that would ignite a firestorm across the Western world: the Crusades. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, under the rallying banner of papal authority, waves of European knights, peasants, and adventurers would embark on a series of holy wars. Their initial stated goal? To reclaim the Holy Land, particularly Jerusalem, from Muslim control. The Fatimid Caliphate, after capturing Palestine in 970, had lost it to the Seljuk Turks in 1073, only to briefly recapture it in 1098, just before the arrival of the First Crusade in 1099. Imagine the fervor, the religious zeal, the promise of spiritual rewards, and earthly plunder that motivated hundreds of thousands to take up the cross. These were not just wars of conquest. They were pilgrimages, acts of penitence, and desperate attempts to secure salvation. But they were also brutal, bloody conflicts, marked by both extraordinary feats of courage and unspeakable acts of cruelty. Out of the crucible of the Crusades emerged a new and fascinating phenomenon: the monastic military orders. These were warrior monks, men who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet wielded swords and lances in the name of God. They were an embodiment of the era's complex fusion of spiritual devotion and martial prowess. Perhaps the most famous, and certainly the most enigmatic, were the Knights Templar. Founded after the First Crusade, their initial purpose was to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Yet, they quickly evolved into something far grander. They became pioneers of banking and finance, their vast wealth and intricate network of strongholds spanning Europe. They were fierce warriors, devout monks, and shrewd financiers all at once. But their immense power and secretive nature ultimately made them a target. In 1307, under accusations of heresy, King Philip IV of France, driven by greed and fear, orchestrated their downfall, arresting and dismantling the entire order. Their story remains a chilling testament to how quickly power can be consolidated and how brutally it can be stripped away. Then there were the Knights Hospitaller, originally an organization dedicated to caring for the poor, sick, and injured pilgrims in Jerusalem. After the First Crusade, they too transformed, becoming a formidable military order charged with the defense and care of the Crusader states. When the Holy Lands were eventually lost to Muslim forces, the Hospitallers, resilient and adaptable, moved their operations, first to Rhodes, and then famously to Malta, continuing their dual mission of healing and fighting for centuries. And across the Baltic in the cold, forested lands of pagan Prussia, another formidable military order arose, the Teutonic Knights. Formed in 1190 to aid pilgrims and operate hospitals in the Holy Lands, they, like their brethren, found a new purpose after the fall of Outremer, moving to Transylvania and then, after being expelled, embarking on a brutal campaign to Christianize the Baltic region. Their story is one of ruthless expansion, of building a vast and powerful monastic state through conquest and conversion, often at the point of sword. However, their power, even against Christian neighbors like Novgorod and Poland, would ultimately be broken in the devastating Battle of Grunwald in 1410, a turning point that marked their long, slow decline. These military orders, born from the fervor of the Crusades, were more than just armies. They were symbols of a changing world, where faith could inspire both profound compassion and devastating violence. The Crusades themselves, a complex tapestry of religious zeal, political ambition, and economic opportunity, would leave an indelible mark on Europe, the Middle East, and the very concept of warfare. They forged new trade routes, brought different cultures into brutal contact, and ultimately reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the High Middle Ages. But beyond the clang of swords and the clash of empires, the High Middle Ages also saw a different kind of awakening, a profound intellectual and spiritual ferment. This was the era of scholasticism, a new method of learning that sought to reconcile faith with reason. Imagine the excitement as scholars rediscovered the long-lost works of Aristotle, not just directly, but often through the brilliant commentaries of medieval Jewish and Muslim philosophers like Maimonides, Avicenna, and Averroes. These ancient texts, once shrouded in obscurity, were brought back from Byzantine and Muslim libraries, igniting a philosophical revolution. At the heart of scholasticism was the belief in empiricism, the idea that knowledge comes from sensory experience, and the desire to support Roman Catholic doctrines through secular study, logic, and rational inquiry. This was a radical departure from earlier forms of Christian mysticism and the Platonic Augustinian belief that the mind was an immaterial substance. The most towering figure of this movement was Thomas Aquinas, later declared a doctor of the Church. Aquinas famously led the charge away from Platonic idealism and towards Aristotelian realism. He proposed that the mind, at birth, was a tabula rasa, a blank slate, given the divine spark to think and recognize forms and ideas. While Aquinas and his contemporaries grappled with profound questions like the problem of universals, the nature of shared qualities in individual things, others like Duns Scotus and William of Ockham challenged various aspects of the scholastic mainstream, proving that even within this structured intellectual framework, fierce debates raged. This period was also a golden age for Christian monasticism. From the late 11th to the mid-12th century, orders like the black-robe Benedictines and the white-robe Cistercians, championed by figures like Bernard of Clairvaux, flourished. These monasteries were centers of learning, innovation, and spiritual devotion, their quiet cloisters a stark contrast to the tumultuous world outside. Yet, as the High Middle Ages progressed into the 13th century, a new wave of religious orders emerged, designed to engage directly with the growing urban populations, the mendicant orders. Unlike the enclosed monks, these begging friars embraced poverty, relying on alms and dedicating themselves to preaching and serving the poor. The Franciscans, founded by the charismatic Francis of Assisi in 1209, emphasized humility, compassion, and a direct imitation of Christ's life. The Carmelites, the Dominicans, known as the Black Friars for their habits, founded by Dominic de Guzman in 1215 to preach against heresy, and the Augustinians all rose during this time, spreading their message throughout the rapidly expanding cities and towns of Europe. But not all new religious movements were embraced by the Church. The very same forces that spurred urbanization and a new money-based economy also fueled the rise of mass movement heresies. Prior to the 11th century, heresies were often localized, isolated incidents. Now, urban centers became breeding grounds for new spiritual interpretations, more attuned to city life than to rural monasticism. The Cathars, or Albigensians, who flourished in southern France and northern Italy, were one such powerful movement. With Gnostic elements, they believed in a dualistic world, a struggle between a good, spiritual force and an evil, material one. They saw the physical world as inherently evil and advocated for asceticism and good works to overcome it. The Catholic Church, viewing their beliefs as a fundamental challenge to its doctrine, responded with unprecedented ferocity, leading to the brutal Albigensian Crusade, a chilling example of religious persecution. Then there were the Waldensians, founded by Peter Waldo of Lyon, a wealthy merchant who, after a profound religious experience around 1175, gave up his riches and became a preacher. The Waldensians believed that all religious practices should have strictly scriptural bases, criticizing the perceived wealth and corruption of the clergy. They rejected practices like the selling of indulgences and the common saint cults. Though condemned by the Church, the Waldensians persisted, laying some of the groundwork for later Protestant Reformation ideas, and indeed, many of their communities eventually merged with the broader Reformed tradition. From the Crusades that shook the Levant to the intellectual battles fought in nascent universities and the spiritual upheavals that challenged the very fabric of the Church, the High Middle Ages were an era of intense faith and profound change. The burning belief of this age shaped empires, inspired scholarship, and ultimately laid the complex foundations for the world that would follow. All right, settle in, everyone. We're moving from the burgeoning towns and fiery pulpits of the High Middle Ages into a landscape carved by ambition, forged in battle, and ultimately shaped by the relentless march of powerful men and their burgeoning nations. This is where the maps of Europe start to look a little more familiar, where the echoes of ancient empires finally fade, and the foundations of modern states begin to emerge from the dust of countless conflicts. The High Middle Ages, this span between roughly 1000 and 1300 AD, was a period of intense transformation. We've already talked about the population boom, the agricultural innovations that fed it, and the renewed intellectual curiosity that sparked the so-called Renaissance of the 12th century. But this societal ferment wasn't just confined to the fields and the burgeoning universities. It spilled over into the political arena, creating a volatile crucible where kingdoms were born, borders were drawn in blood, and the very concept of national identity began to take root. Imagine a tapestry, vast and intricate. On one side, the threads are loose, undefined, the colors blending into vague tribal patterns. This is the early Middle Ages. But now, in the High Middle Ages, skilled weavers, kings, emperors, and fierce warlords begin to pull those threads taut, to define distinct patterns, to inject vibrant, sometimes clashing colors. These patterns are the nascent nations of Europe. Let's journey across this evolving map, starting with an island that would one day command a global empire, Great Britain. The year is 1066, a date etched into every schoolchild's memory, and for good reason. The Norman Conquest. William the Conqueror lands his forces, defeats the English at the Battle of Hastings, and forever changes the course of English history. Suddenly, a Francophone nobility rules over an Anglo-Saxon populace. This isn't just a change of kings. It's a fundamental shift in culture, language, and governance. The Normans, with their advanced administrative techniques, began to lay the groundwork for a more centralized state. Think of King Henry I, who in the 12th century established the Exchequer, a formal department for managing royal finances. This was a crucial step towards organized, long-term governance, far beyond the personal whims of a chieftain. And then, in 1215, a document of immense significance, born out of royal weakness and baronial strength, the Magna Carta. King John, having lost much of his territory in France, found himself backed into a corner. The barons, tired of his arbitrary rule and heavy taxes, forced his hand. The Magna Carta wasn't a document of universal rights as we understand them today, but it was a revolutionary limitation on the power of the monarch. It established the principle that even the king was subject to the law, a concept that would echo through centuries and across continents, influencing legal systems far beyond England's shores. But England wasn't alone in this age of consolidation. The Normans, those ambitious and formidable warriors, also set their sights on Ireland in 1169, establishing strongholds and influencing much of the country. Scotland and Wales, too, felt the immense pressure of their powerful neighbor, often subdued into vassalage, though Scotland would fiercely assert its independence, and Wales would largely maintain its native princes until the tragic death of Llywelyn ap Gruffydd in 1282. Now let's turn our gaze south to the sun-drenched, yet war-torn Iberian Peninsula. This was a land shaped by the centuries-long struggle between Christian kingdoms in the north and Muslim rule in the south, a conflict known as the Reconquista. The Christian conquest of Toledo in 1085 was a pivotal moment, a symbolic shift in the tide. This wasn't just about territorial gains. It was about the very fabric of society. The northern Christian kingdoms became militarized societies, where the demands of omnipresent conflict dictated everything. Knights and foot soldiers were not just warriors. They were pioneers, pushing the frontiers southward, often incentivized with privileges and land in these newly conquered territories. Imagine these border societies, a rugged, dangerous landscape where military prowess was valued above all else. Here, powerful military orders like the Knights of Santiago or the Order of Calatrava played a crucial role, not just as fighting forces, but as guardians and settlers of these wild new lands. Meanwhile, in the Muslim-ruled territories of Al-Andalus, a different model prevailed. With intensive agriculture and a sophisticated urban culture, there wasn't the same drive for territorial expansion. But even here, state structures were often volatile, particularly with the arrival of the Almoravids and Almohads from North Africa, whose powerful yet ephemeral empires rose and fell like desert winds. Across the Mediterranean, Italy, a patchwork of competing powers, also experienced significant changes. The Norman ambition, once again, was a catalyst. In southern Italy, They forged the powerful Kingdom of Sicily, a hereditary monarchy that, for a time, was a jewel in the crown of the Holy Roman Empire, particularly under the dazzling reign of Emperor Frederick II. He was a truly fascinating figure, a polyglot, a patron of arts and sciences, known as Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. He embodied the intellectual curiosity of the age, even while ruling with an iron fist. But beyond the unified kingdom in the south, the rest of Italy saw the spectacular rise of independent city-states. Pisa, Amalfi, Genoa, and Venice. These weren't just cities. They were thalassocracies, empires of the sea. They grew fabulously wealthy on Eastern Mediterranean maritime trade, becoming the major financial centers of Europe. Picture the bustling ports, the ships laden with silks, spices, and exotic goods, the vibrant markets where merchants from across the known world haggled and traded. These cities were engines of commerce, innovation, and, perhaps most importantly, political independence. Journey north once more to the rugged lands of Scandinavia. From the mid-10th to the mid-11th centuries, these kingdoms were unified and, crucially, Christianized. The fearsome Viking raids, which had terrorized Europe for centuries, finally came to an end. Instead, these Norse kingdoms began to integrate into the broader European political landscape. For a brief, dazzling period, King Knut of Denmark ruled over an impressive North Sea empire, encompassing England and Norway. But like many empires, it was fleeting. After Knut's death, England and Norway were lost, and Danish dominance in the region waned. Norway, for its part, extended its Atlantic possessions, reaching from Greenland all the way to the Isle of Man, a testament to their enduring seafaring prowess, though internal civil wars would plague them for much of the 12th and 13th centuries. Sweden, under the astute leadership of Bergri Jarl, began to consolidate its power in the Baltic Sea, setting the stage for its future as a regional force. Now, let's consider the heart of Europe, France and Germany. By the High Middle Ages, the vast, sprawling Carolingian Empire had long since fragmented. In its place stood distinct successor kingdoms, though their boundaries were far from fixed. France, largely pushing westward, saw the rise and fall of formidable dynasties. The Angevin Empire, a creation of the English Plantagenet kings, controlled a massive swathe of France in the 12th and early 13th centuries, posing a constant threat to the French crown. But the French kings, through shrewd political maneuvering and persistent military action, slowly but surely retook much of their ancestral territory, solidifying the foundations of what would become modern France. Germany, on the other hand, lay further to the east, united under the sprawling, often unwieldy banner of the Holy Roman Empire. This was a unique entity, a collection of duchies, counties, and free cities, all theoretically loyal to an elected emperor who claimed a legacy stretching back to Charlemagne and even ancient Rome. The empire reached its zenith of unity and political power under the formidable Kaiser Frederick Barbarossa. Imagine him, a red-bearded, charismatic leader, striving to assert imperial authority over his often recalcitrant princes and the powerful Italian city-states. His reign was a constant balancing act between his vision of a unified empire and the deeply entrenched local autonomies. Eastward still, we find kingdoms that often get less attention in Western European narratives, but whose stories are no less compelling. Take Georgia, for example. During the reign of King David IV, often called the Builder, from 1089 to 1125, Georgia experienced a remarkable golden age. David expelled the Seljuk Turks from his lands, culminating in the decisive victory at the Battle of Digori in 1121, which led to the recapture of his capital, Tbilisi. His granddaughter, Queen Tamar, continued this ascent, consolidating an empire that stretched from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea. This was a powerful, vibrant Christian kingdom, a beacon in the Caucasus, until its eventual collapse under the devastating Mongol invasions of the 13th century. And then there's Hungary. Established as a Christian kingdom in 1000 under King Saint Stephen I, and later ruled by the Arpad dynasty, Hungary became one of the most powerful medieval states in Europe. King Saint Ladislaus consolidated the Hungarian state and strengthened Christianity, expanding the kingdom to the Adriatic coast and forming a personal union with Croatia in 1102. This was truly a small empire, extending its control over southeast Europe and the Carpathian region, a testament to the enduring power and influence of its ruling house, which produced an astonishing number of saints and blessed individuals. Further north, Lithuania emerged as a powerful duchy in the early 13th century, briefly a kingdom under Mindaugas, its first Christian king. Unconquered during the brutal Lithuanian Crusade, it rapidly expanded eastward, becoming one of the largest states in Europe, a defiant pagan stronghold in a largely Christianized continent, until its eventual conversion. And Poland, too, established itself as a duchy in the mid-10th century under Mieszko I, becoming a recognized kingdom in 1025 under Boleslaw I the Brave. Southeast Europe, for much of this period, remained under the sway of the Byzantine Empire. Under the Comnenian emperors, there was a revival of prosperity and urbanization, a final flicker of the ancient Roman flame. But even here, their dominance began to wane. The successful Vlach-Bulgarian rebellion in 1185 and the disastrous Fourth Crusade in 1204, which saw the treacherous capture of Constantinople by Western Crusaders, dealt a crippling blow. The Byzantine Empire, though re-established in 1261, never truly recovered its former glory, slowly faltering until its final demise in the mid-15th century. This was also a period where the seeds of later geopolitical struggles were sown. The East-West Schism of 1054 formally divided the Christian Church into Roman Catholicism in the West and Eastern Orthodoxy in the East. This wasn't just a theological dispute. It was a deep cultural and political rift that would have profound consequences for centuries, shaping alliances and animosities. And then, of course, there were the Crusades. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, under papal authority, armies from across Europe were called to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. These were not just religious wars. They were massive undertakings, driven by a complex mix of piety, land hunger, mercantile ambition, and a desire for glory. They reshaped the political landscape of the Levant, leading to the creation of the Crusader states, and profoundly impacted Europe itself. Out of the Crusades emerged a new phenomenon: the monastic military orders. Imagine fierce warriors, bound by monastic vows, dedicating their lives to both God and the sword. The Knights Templar, initially founded to protect pilgrims, became deeply involved in banking, wielding immense financial power until their dramatic and brutal suppression by Philip the Fair of France in 1307. The Knights Hospitaller, originally caring for the sick and poor, transformed into a military order defending the Crusader states. And the Teutonic Knights, a German order, famously moved their operations to the Baltic, embarking on the Northern Crusades to Christianize pagan Prussia, creating a powerful monastic state that would dominate the region for centuries. These orders were a fusion of spiritual devotion and military might, embodying the ideals of Christian chivalry, even if their actions were often anything but purely spiritual. But what about the concept of chivalry itself? How did this idea of a Christian warrior, noble and selfless, truly take hold? As Christianity became more prominent, the ideal knight was no longer just a brutal fighter. He was expected to be faithful, to protect the weak, and to fight ethically. Household heavy cavalry, the knights we so often picture in shining armor, became common across Europe by the 11th century. Tournaments, those spectacular displays of martial prowess, weren't just entertainment. They were vital opportunities for knights to establish their family name, gain renown, and amass wealth through victory. Later, in the 12th century, the Cluny monks, influential monastic reformers, promoted ethical warfare and inspired the formation of the chivalric orders, further cementing these ideals. This era also saw the establishment of inherited titles of nobility. No longer were lords just powerful strongmen. They were part of a defined social hierarchy, their status often passed down through generations. In 13th century Germany, Knighthood itself even became an inheritable title, though one of lesser prestige, a trend that gradually spread throughout other European countries. The social order, while still brutal and hierarchical, was becoming more formalized, more structured, laying the groundwork for the aristocratic systems that would dominate Europe for centuries to come. Amidst all this political and military upheaval, Europe was also experiencing a golden age of climate. The medieval warm period, from roughly the 10th to the 14th century, was a period of relatively mild temperatures and favorable growing conditions. Farmers were able to grow wheat further north, even into Scandinavia, and vineyards flourished in northern England. This increased agricultural output, thanks also to innovations like the heavier plow, the use of horses instead of oxen, and the highly efficient three-field system of crop rotation, helped feed the rapidly growing population. This surplus of food, though punctuated by periods of scarcity like the devastating famine of 1315, allowed for the founding of new towns, an increase in industrial and economic activity, and a robust expansion of trade. It was a time when the very land seemed to cooperate with human ambition, providing the resources needed for these grand social and political transformations. So, as the High Middle Ages drew to a close, Europe was a vastly different place than it had been 3 centuries earlier. The loose tribal structures of the past had given way to more defined kingdoms and empires. The Church, while experiencing internal schisms and external challenges from nascent heretical movements, still wielded immense power, inspiring both great acts of faith and brutal crusades. A new class of nobility, bound by emerging codes of chivalry, solidified its position, while powerful city-states carved out their own destinies through trade and naval dominance. The foundations of nations were being laid, not smoothly or peacefully, but through a constant interplay of ambition, conflict, innovation, and faith. The next era, the late Middle Ages, would test these nascent structures to their very limits, as a series of devastating crises swept across the continent. But for now, the stage was set for the grand drama of kings, empires, and the forging of nations. And now, after traversing the battlefields, the burgeoning fields, and the shifting power of kings and popes, we arrive at a different kind of landscape. One painted with vibrant colors, etched with soaring arches, and filled with the resonance of human ingenuity and spiritual yearning. We step beyond the stone walls of castles and cathedrals to explore the dazzling art, the evocative music, and the profound literature that defined the High Middle Ages. This period, from roughly the year 1000 to 1300, wasn't just about survival or political maneuvering. It was a time of immense intellectual and artistic flourishing, a kind of cultural explosion that laid foundations for so much of what we recognize as European identity today. The burgeoning populations, the rise of towns, and the increasing stability, hard-won as it was, all contributed to an environment where creativity could, quite literally, reach for the heavens. Let's begin with the visible, the tangible testament to this era's ambition, its architecture. The High Middle Ages witnessed a revolution in how people built, particularly how they built their most sacred spaces. While the earlier Romanesque style had been characterized by its robust, often heavy forms, with thick walls and rounded arches, the Gothic style burst onto the scene with a completely new vision. Imagine a world where buildings, previously appearing rooted to the earth, suddenly seemed to defy gravity, reaching upwards with an almost impossible lightness. Gothic architecture was more than just a new aesthetic. It was a theological statement. The architects and master masons of the time believed that light was a direct manifestation of God's presence. So, their goal became to flood these sacred spaces with as much light as possible. They achieved this through a series of brilliant innovations. The flying buttress, those elegant external supports that allowed for thinner, taller walls. The pointed arch, which distributed weight more effectively than its rounded predecessor. and the rib vault, which channeled the immense weight of the ceiling down to specific points of support. The result was breathtaking. Churches like Notre Dame de Paris, Chartres, or Salisbury Cathedral were not just buildings. They were experiences. The interiors, once somber and cavernous, became luminous. Walls, no longer needed for primary structural support, could be replaced with vast expanses of stained glass. Imagine the awe of a medieval peasant stepping from the drab, often muddy streets into a cathedral bathed in a kaleidoscope of colored light, depicting biblical stories with a vibrancy that would have been utterly mesmerizing. Color, after all, was a rarity in everyday life. These virtuoso works of art, illuminated by the sun, must have had an almost divine impact on the common man. The intricate ribbed and fan vaultings above, stretching like a celestial canopy, further emphasized this movement towards heaven. The sheer scale of these structures, towering over every other building in the town, also spoke volumes about the greatness of God. A Gothic cathedral wasn't merely a place of worship. It was a didactic tool, an invitation to spiritual elevation, and a powerful demonstration of faith made manifest in stone and light. And for those who appreciated order and reason, the floor plan of a Gothic cathedral often reflected the rules of scholasticism, divided into sections and uniform subsections, mirroring the logical structure of thought that was so prevalent in the era. But beyond the imposing grandeur of architecture, the visual arts of the High Middle Ages were rich and diverse. We saw the continued influence of Anglo-Saxon art in the British Isles before the Norman conquest, a style rich in intricate patterns and zoomorphic forms. Romanesque art carried on traditions from the classical world, often adorning churches with vibrant frescoes and detailed sculptural programs. As Gothic architecture developed, so too did Gothic art, particularly in Germany, where it acquired its own distinct flavor. Focusing on human emotion and naturalistic detail, a subtle shift from the more abstract forms of earlier periods. And let us not forget the illuminated manuscripts. These were not just books, they were treasures, handcrafted and often adorned with gold leaf and brilliant pigments. In a time when literacy was limited, these lavishly illustrated texts, both Catholic and Orthodox, served as visual sermons, conveying religious narratives and theological concepts with stunning artistry. Imagine the patient dedication, the steady hand of a monk or scribe, meticulously rendering each letter, each border, each miniature painting, transforming parchment into a sacred object. Moving from the visual to the auditory, the music of the High Middle Ages, much like its art, was deeply intertwined with the Church. Gregorian chant, that ethereal, monophonic vocal music, remained a dominant form. But the period witnessed a profound evolution, a literal blossoming of sound. This was the era when polyphony began to emerge, adding layers of independent melodic lines to the chant. Imagine the sheer innovation of this, taking a single, ancient melody and weaving other voices around it, creating harmonies that would have been utterly revolutionary to medieval ears. The Notre Dame school in France, with figures like Léonin and Periton, were pioneers in this development, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the complex musical structures of the late Middle Ages. And while much of the surviving music is religious, we must acknowledge the vibrant secular traditions that also flourished. The troubadours of Occitania in southern France were particularly significant. These wandering poet-musicians, often from all strata of society, wrote songs on a vast array of topics, but they are perhaps best remembered for their focus on courtly love. Their melodies and poetic forms spread their influence across Europe, inspiring the trouvères in northern France and the Minzingers of Germany. Imagine listening to their passionate verses, perhaps performed in a lord's hall or a bustling marketplace, painting vivid pictures of chivalry and idealized romance. Finally, we turn to the literature, a mirror reflecting the evolving worldview of this dynamic era. Christianity, naturally, was a powerful shaping force, particularly in Latin literature. But this influence began to seep into the vernacular languages, giving rise to interconnected cycles of stories that captivated audiences then and continue to enthrall us now. There was the Matter of Rome, drawing from classical antiquity, the Matter of France, celebrating Charlemagne and his valiant knights, and the acritic songs, tales of Byzantine frontiersmen. But perhaps the most enduring and beloved literary cycle was the Matter of Britain, featuring the legendary King Arthur, his loyal knights of the Round Table, and the mystical realm of Camelot. These tales, originating from Brittany, Cornwall, Wales, and Ireland, spoke of heroism, magic, betrayal, and the quest for spiritual ideals. An anonymous German poet, not to be outdone, brought Germanic myths from the migration period to epic status with the Nibelungenlied, a saga of dragons, curses, and tragic heroes. The Byzantine scholarly tradition, despite political challenges, remained remarkably fruitful. Philosophers like Michael Sellos reinvigorated Neoplatonism, blending ancient wisdom with Christian thought. And while the towering allegorical poem of the late Middle Ages, Dante's Divine Comedy, might technically fall just outside our scope, it is crucial to remember that it was a profound product of the theology of thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and the vibrant, often secular, Occitan literature that flourished in this period. And what about theater? The growth of towns and the formation of guilds brought about significant changes. Trade guilds began to perform plays, often rooted in religious themes, with biblical stories directly referencing their professions. Imagine a baker's guild performing the Last Supper or a shipwright's guild reenacting Noah's Arkansas. These vernacular mystery plays, written in cycles, could be quite extensive, with towns like York boasting 48 separate plays. They weren't always solemn. Many included comedy, devils, villains, and even clowns, offering a lively and accessible form of entertainment and instruction. Beyond religious dramas, secular performances also gained traction, with farces emphasizing body humor and bodily functions, growing dramatically in popularity after the 13th century. So, as we conclude this journey through the High Middle Ages, we find an era that was far more than just dark. It was a time of immense human endeavor, intellectual awakening, and artistic brilliance. The soaring spires of Gothic cathedrals, the intricate beauty of illuminated manuscripts, the complex harmonies of polyphonic music, and the timeless tales of chivalry and romance all stand as vibrant testaments to a period that dared to dream, to build, and to create beyond the mere necessities of survival. These were the seeds of progress, sown not just in fertile soil, but in the fertile minds of men and women who, even in an age we often perceive as harsh, found profound ways to express the dazzling beauty and complexity of their world. And so, our journey through the High Middle Ages draws to a close, a testament to humanity's enduring capacity for both creation and conflict. We've witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the clash of faiths, and the blossoming of art and innovation. I hope this deep dive into medieval Europe has been as captivating for you as it was for me to narrate. If you enjoyed this exploration, please consider leaving a like, sharing it with someone who appreciates a good story, and subscribing to Vibing History for more immersive documentaries. What were your biggest takeaways from this era? And what other periods or forgotten stories would you like us to uncover next? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, keep vibing with history.